And as well as that, I'm a Russian citizen. So before I start with a brief introduction, I want to say that the format of this webinar, Professor Noam Chomsky is gonna begin with his opening remarks, and then it's gonna be followed by Q&A. So please feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and I will collect them and ask them after. So just this Tuesday, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has surpassed 3 months, and day by day, the enormous damage and suffering caused by this conflict are intensifying. We have seen negotiations, but they seem not to have progressed much to this day. And unfortunately, the US is playing a huge role in this conflict by supplying billions of dollars in weapons and not agreeing to come to the table to negotiate. At this point, United States no longer only seeks to defend Ukraine, but to profoundly weaken and isolate Russia from the world. Sending more weapons to Ukraine is not going to ease or end this conflict, but in fact can only intensify and escalate it, leading us closer to a nuclear war. We have never been in such danger of nuclear war since the arms race during the Cold War. As Noam Chomsky has said during one of his most recent interviews, we're approaching the most dangerous point in human history. With that said, I want to introduce and welcome renowned linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky, who will give us more insights on Ukraine and beyond. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us.
Thank you very much. Nice to be partially at home, even if vicariously. Well, you've, I assume, read the announcement. It raises many questions of critical importance. Each of them deserves careful attention, serious discussion. I'll only be able to touch on a few of them, and those inadequately. I hope we can pursue those critical topics in depth in the discussion later. Well, the focus of attention today is on Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Serious crime can be compared to the US invasion of Iraq or the Stalin-Hitler invasion of Poland, kind of crimes for which Nazi war criminals were hanged, though in what we call civilization, only the defeated are subject to punishment. Well, that focus of attention is quite justified, not only because of the terrible events in Ukraine, but also because of the broader implications, which are truly colossal. That's no exaggeration. One of them is that literally tens of millions of people in Asia, Africa, Middle East are facing starvation as the war proceeds. It's cutting off desperately needed agricultural supplies, food, fertilizer, others from the Black Sea region. It's the primary supplier for many countries, including some already facing utter disaster, like Yemen. I'll return to how that issue is being handled. It's quite instructive. The second is the growing threat of terminal nuclear war. It's all too easy to construct plausible scenarios that lead to a rapid climb up the escalation ladder. To take one, right now, the United States is sending advanced anti-ship missiles to Ukraine. The flagship of the Russian fleet has already been destroyed by them. Suppose more of the fleet is attacked. How does Russia then react? Well, to mention another, so far, Russia has refrained from attacking the supply lines that are being used to ship heavy armaments to Ukraine. Suppose it does so, places it in direct confrontation with NATO, meaning the US. I leave the rest to your imagination. Well, there are other proposals that are circulating in high places that would almost certainly lead to nuclear war, which means the end for all of us. Facts that don't seem to be properly understood. One example is a no-fly zone. No-fly zone means gaining control of the air. That means attacking Russian anti-aircraft installations, which happen to be inside Russia. Well, the insanity of these proposals is understood by some, mainly the Pentagon, the one peacekeeping element in the US government, which so far has been able to veto the most dangerous proposals. For how long can it do so in the prevailing atmosphere of irrationality and hysteria? Well, it gets worse. The Ukraine invasion has reversed the much too limited efforts to address global warming, soon to become global frying. Prior to the invasion, some steps, nowhere near enough, but some steps were being taken to avert catastrophe. Now that has all been thrown into reverse. One day, the IPCC issues another severe warning, saying that if we are to survive, we must start right now to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Right now, no delay. The next day, President Biden announces vast new expansion of fossil fuel production. If current trends persist, South Asia, Middle East, much of Africa will become unlivable. And for those who manage to survive, it'll be hardly worth living. Biden's call to increase fossil fuel production is sheer political theater. It has nothing to do with today's fuel prices or with inflation. It'll be years before the poisons reach the market, years that could be spent on moving the world rapidly to renewable energy. That's perfectly feasible, barely discussed, can return to it, raises very important questions. Well, that going on, it's crystal clear that settling the Ukraine crisis is of extraordinary significance, not just for Ukraine itself, but because of the calamitous consequences if the war persists. Is there anything we can do to facilitate ending the tragedy? Should be thought through carefully, without posturing, without heroic gestures. Think it through. Well, let's begin with virtual truisms. The war can end in one of two ways. Either there will be a diplomatic settlement or one side will capitulate. That's truism. That at least should be beyond discussion. Well, a diplomatic settlement differs from capitulation in one crucial respect. Each side accepts it as tolerable. They don't go get what they want, but they can live with it. That's true by definition. That's diplomacy. So that's beyond discussion. Well, proceeding with truisms, a diplomatic settlement must offer Putin some kind of escape hatch, what's now disdainfully ridiculed as an off-ramp or appeasement by those who wish to prolong the war. That much, I should say, is understood even by people with pretty extreme positions, like the distinguished liberal Harvard professor Graham Allison, who instructs us that Putin is a demon, radically unlike any American leader. American leaders only make mistakes, but never commit crimes. That's by definition. 5 years ago, Allison, is long before the invasion of Ukraine, Allison wrote that it is clear that Russia as a whole, not just Putin, is demonic and deserves to be strangled. That's liberal Harvard instructing us. Nevertheless, he says, we must contain our righteous anger and bring the war to a quick end, and by diplomatic means, because, now quoting him, if the demon is forced to choose between losing and escalating the level of violence and destruction, then if he's a rational actor, as he seems to be, he's going to choose the latter, and we'll all be dead. So we have to overcome our anger at this loathsome society that has to be strangled and somehow deal with it from our position of nobility and angelic commitment to human rights, freedom, and democracy. Well, proceeding with truism, to oppose or even act to delay a diplomatic settlement is to call for prolonging the war with all of its grim consequences for Ukraine and beyond. Worse still, it's to call for a ghastly experiment. Let's see whether Putin will slink away quietly in total defeat, or whether he'll use the weapons that he indisputably has to devastate Ukraine and set the stage for terminal war. That's the ghastly experiment, which happens to be operative US policy and is supported by a wide range of opinion, always with noble rhetoric about how we must stand up for principle and not permit a crime to go unpunished. Well, when we hear this from supporters of US crimes, as we commonly do, we can simply dismiss it as sheer cynicism. More interestingly for us, we hear it from our friends, from opponents of US crimes, who surely do not want to carry out the ghastly experiment that they are in fact advocating. At this point, some other questions arise. The rising tide of sheer irrationality that is undermining any hope for serious discourse, which is a necessity, not only for Ukraine, but if the human experiment is to persist much longer. Well, if we can escape cynicism and irrationality, the humane choice for the West is straightforward. Seek to facilitate a diplomatic settlement. On this matter, official Western opinion is split. France, Germany, and Italy are seeking negotiations to establish a ceasefire to move towards a diplomatic settlement. The United States and Britain, the two warrior states, want to drag it out. Their position is that the war must proceed. This was made, we must carry out the ghastly experiment. This was made very explicit a couple of weeks ago at the Ramstein US base in Germany, US military base in Germany. The United States called the NATO powers and a few others called the contact group, called them together, not at Brussels, the headquarters of NATO, at a US air base. That's more than symbolic. That's saying we're giving you the orders, the marching orders. And here they are. The marching orders are, we have to continue to fight the war, let the Ukrainians fight the war to harm Russia, whatever the consequences for Ukrainians, whatever the so-called collateral damage beyond mass starvation, destruction of the environment that sustains life, possible terminal war, doesn't matter. We have to harm Russians. Well, similar questions arise with regard to the blockade and the mass starvation that it's causing. Right now, Ukrainian ports are blocked by the Russian Navy. That's preventing desperately needed exports. So what can we do about it? Well, one possibility is official US policy. Send advanced anti-ship missiles to sink the Russian ships. Already sank the flagship of the Russian fleet with new shipments. More can be sunk. Will the Russians observe quietly? Maybe. How would the US react under similar circumstances? So put that aside. Another possibility, supported among others by the Wall Street Journal editors, I'm quoting them, use warships, US warships, to escort merchant ships out of the Black Sea. The editors assure us that this would conform to international law. They also say that Russians are total savages who will stop at nothing. Those are the two ideas you have to keep in mind. So if they react in their savage manner, we can proclaim proudly that we upheld international law as the whole world goes down in flames. That's considered sophisticated opinion. Actually, Moscow has a different proposal, but in our increasingly totalitarian culture can only be reported at the extreme margins. I found it at a libertarian website where it was reported a week ago. I'll quote it. They write, Moscow has offered a diplomatic solution to the Black Sea standoff. On May 19th, the Kremlin proposed lifting the blockage in exchange for some sanctions relief. The Russian Foreign Ministry said the problem goes beyond the blockade and includes Western sanctions restricting fertilizer exports from Russia. Quote him, you have to not only appeal to the Russian Federation, but also look deeply at the whole complex of reasons that cause the current food crisis. Sanctions interfere with normal free trade, encompassing food products, including wheat, fertilizers, and others. That's the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister. Well, is that worth considering? Worth even reporting? Not in our culture, which automatically reaches for the revolver. Just war, no other option. That's us. This reflexive preference for violence and its very grim consequences have not been overlooked abroad. It's quite common in the global South, which has ample experience of our nobility. But even among allies, like Australia, where the editor of one of the main international affairs journals, Arena, deplores the rigid censorship and intolerance of even mild dissent in US media. Quote him, this means it is almost impossible within mainstream opinion to simultaneously acknowledge Putin's insupportable actions and to forge a path out of the war that does not involve escalation and the further destruction of Ukraine. He could have added that the censorship here is so extreme that Americans are prevented from hearing Russian opinion. RT, other Russian outlets are just closed. You want to find out what Prime Minister Lavrov said about something, good luck. You can find it in the Indian state TV or in Al Jazeera or other Middle East journals. But here, Americans have to be protected. Well, unless we can escape this self-imposed trap, we're likely to march on to annihilation with lots of heroic posturing. It's kind of reminiscent of the days before World War I. It's long enough ago so we can think about that. This time, the consequences are incomparably more severe. Well, I'll finish with some comment on a model that is of great relevance because it's pretty much what is now official policy, what's being pursued by Washington and openly advocated in mainstream opinion. Hillary Clinton, to mention one who was quite explicit about it. We should follow what's called the Afghan model that refers to US practice during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That model was initiated by President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and pursued very successfully in his judgment. The policy, explicit, was to draw Russia into what was called an Afghan trap, then to mobilize the most extremist, radical Islamists anywhere to bleed Russia till they finally withdrew in defeat. A couple of years later, Brzezinski was asked about the cost to Afghans. He simply dismissed it. As he put it, destroying the Soviet Union can't be compared with leaving a few agitated Muslims, his phrase, referring to about 1 million cadavers and vast destruction. Since that's the model that's now being pursued and advocated, it's worth a look. Fortunately, we can do that. We now have a detailed, definitive study of the Russian withdrawal by Diego Cordovez. He was the UN negotiator whose dedicated efforts ended the conflict, along with Zelig Harrison, highly regarded journalist and scholar with extensive experience in Afghanistan. Their analysis, which I urge you to read, completely overthrows the standard version. Brzezinski's tale of his overthrowing the Soviet Union is total fantasy. It happened for quite different internal reasons, having nothing to do with Afghanistan. The Afghan war was ended by careful UN-run diplomacy, not by military force. Soviet military forces were perfectly stable, fully capable of continuing the war. They had a relatively popular government in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Najibullah government, which in fact held out for 3 years after the Russians left. That's unlike what we have just seen. The planned Russian withdrawal from the early 80s was delayed for years by US efforts to prolong the war to harm Russians. the policy, I'm quoting Cordovez and Harrison, the policy was fighting to the last Afghan, fighting Russia to the last Afghan. It was a proxy war to weaken the Soviet Union. Quote them again. The United States did its best to prevent the emergence of the careful diplomatic efforts that ended the war. That's the Afghan model we're pursuing. If it sounds like something that's happening today, it's because it is. The facts don't disappear because the media and the political class are unified in suppressing them to a degree that is quite remarkable. Well, the worst can only be avoided by diplomacy that might have averted the catastrophe in the first place if the United States had been willing to engage in it. And while the options have narrowed, they still exist. I won't review the record here. It's very instructive. I've done so elsewhere. But the basic fact is that for years, US policy has been to integrate Ukraine into the NATO military command and to reject diplomacy. It hasn't been hidden, except to the US public. It's all perfectly public. The Russians know all about it. They can read the White House webpage, even if the US press can't. Well, the policy continues today, by now quite openly. We are therefore choosing to undertake the ghastly experiment with all of the consequences it entails. Well, it's all too easy to paint an ugly picture, and it's worth doing to see what might come about and what we must work hard to prevent. That can be done. For every problem we face, however severe, there are feasible answers. As I'm sure you know, the World Social Forum had its annual meeting a couple of weeks ago. It forcefully reiterated its slogan, another world is possible. That's right, another world is possible. It's not going to come into being without hard, dedicated work. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Noam Chomsky, for this brief introduction with a lot of information. So, United States is quite involved in this conflict, and I just want to go a little bit back before the war started and the invasion by Russians were carried out. Many people around the world believe that the relentless expansion of NATO and its threat to include Ukraine was the primarily cause of President Putin's decision to invade. When the so-called military operation started, President Putin said that Russia could no longer support the blackmailing from the West and its ignorance of Russia's demands. Do you think that the potential NATO expansion was the reason for the decision to start this war, and how could it have been prevented? Was there any way to prevent the war from happening?
Yes. I mean, instead of my opinion, which doesn't matter, I'll give you the opinion of just about every high US official who has any familiarity with Russia, including the director of the CIA, William Burns, his predecessor, Stanfield Turner, just about every high US diplomat who, again, has acquaintance with Russia, Jack Matlock, a Russian specialist who was Reagan's ambassador, George Kennan, famously, a whole host of others, even hawks like Paul Nitze and others. For 35 years, they've been warning the United States, the government, warning them that disregarding Russian security concerns by expanding NATO is a dangerous, reckless, and provocative policy. Well, Russia was, we have to go back a step. There's been a lot of deceit about this, so we should be clear. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were negotiations between the first President Bush and Gorbachev. President Bush made a clear, unambiguous, explicit promise, no ambiguity, that if Gorbachev agreed to let Germany unite within NATO, no small concession for Russia, but if they agreed to that, NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. Again, lots of deceit about it. So I urge you to look it up in the National Security Archives, the definitive resource. You can find it on Google in 2 minutes. Look up National Security Archives on NATO expansion. You can read the document, clear and explicit. George Bush lived up to it. For the first couple of years, Clinton lived up to it. He was the successor. By the mid-1990s, Clinton was talking out of both sides of his mouth. To Russia, he was saying, we're living up to it. To local ethnic communities, he was a political animal. To local ethnic communities, he was starting to say, don't worry, we'll bring you into NATO. His eye was on the domestic vote. He actually made this explicit in a conversation with his friend, Yeltsin, where he told Yeltsin, don't worry about all this talk, I need it to win the election. Well, by 1997, Clinton violated it. He invited the so-called Visegrad countries in. His successor, second Bush, just threw the door open, invited everybody in, even called for Ukraine to join NATO. Every American leader, all of them, understood that Ukraine is a red line for Russia. You take a look at a map, take a look at recent history, Operation Barbarossa, it's perfectly obvious why. Ukraine and Georgia, no Russian leader, Gorbachev, anybody would accept NATO expansion there. Every American leader knew it. They were all warned about it on high places. George W. Bush threw it out, said, let's invite them. Well, he was stopped by France and Germany, but US power is so extreme that it stayed on the agenda. We're still seeing it right now with France, Germany, now also Italy, moving to try to lead to some kind of accommodation, the United States and Britain blocking it. Well, after 2014, after the Maidan uprising just became open, the US simply started pouring heavy weapons into Ukraine, advanced military training, joint military exercises. Absolutely no secret about this. Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, just announced proudly a couple of weeks ago that this is what we'd been doing. When Biden came in, he escalated it. You can read it on the government webpage, not in the newspapers. They suppressed it. But last September, Biden announced a program to expand this. Military training, heavy weapons, joint military exercises, all within what was called an enhanced program to prepare for NATO membership. This was carried further in November by a charter signed by the Secretary of State. In March of this year, that was all before the invasion. In March, right after the invasion, the State Department conceded that Russian security concerns were not considered at all in the interchange prior to the invasion. It's about as crystal clear as you can get in current history. There's all kind of evasion and so on about what's going on in Putin's demonic mind and so on. I don't know anything about that, but these are the facts that we know. And it's not my opinion. It's the opinion of just about every high official who knows anything about Russia. And it's pretty obvious when you think about it. As I say, just take a look at Ukraine on the map. Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion, went right through Ukraine. There's no defensible borders between Kiev and Moscow, flat plains. I mean, it's pretty transparent.
Thank you, Noam. We have plenty of questions from the audience. So United States is deeply involved in this conflict, and Alexandra Tapley asks, can the war in Ukraine be categorized as a proxy war facilitated by the United States, which started during the Obama administration?
It's been claimed by credible commentators. I've myself hesitated from drawing that conclusion, but it's pretty hard to avoid. I mean, we can speculate about it, but it's harder and harder to avoid when you look at the clear facts. Almost all of them suppressed, incidentally. We're not allowed to talk about it. I mean, we can find out, it's not secret. You want to read William Burns's memoirs, you can read them. But you want to read the White House webpage, yeah, you can read it. But it's mostly kept from the population. I should say I've been around a long time. One of my qualifications, maybe I'll put it on my CV someday, is that I'm probably the only living person who condemned the Munich agreements in print as soon as they were signed. Okay, so some experience. I have never seen censorship and repression like today. I mean, even just the blocking of Russian voices, which is insane. Why shouldn't we know what the Russians are saying? Why do I have to go to Al Jazeera to find out what the Russian Prime Minister is saying? That's the kind of thing we ought to know. If they have a proposal for ending a blockade that's killing millions of people, why shouldn't I know about it? Well, the censorship is so extreme that you can't. Almost nobody knows unless they go to something like marginal libertarian website, which happens to be telling the truth. It's crazy. And not only that, if you bring it up, just talk about it, you're immediately vilified, a Putin supporter, a commie rat, you want appeasement, you want to sell out, and so on. It's pretty astonishing. I tried to find some statesman in the United States and Britain, the two warrior states, who was actually talking some sense on the need to try to seek negotiations instead of undermining them. I found two. Jeremy Corbyn in England, who was driven out of the Labour Party, like Keir Starmer, for daring to say something sensible. In the United States, I found one, Donald Trump. I happened to mention this in a talk that elicited a storm of fury from the internet left. How can you dare tell the truth about Donald Trump? Total monster, of course. But he happened to be right. Okay, should we keep it secret? I mean, have we reached that level of totalitarianism, internal totalitarianism, that we just can't talk about facts because they're the wrong kind of facts? Well, apparently we have. And it doesn't help anyone. Certainly doesn't help Ukrainians. Following the Afghan model, fighting Russia to the last Afghan, doesn't help Ukrainians, doesn't help the rest of the world.
Thank you. So Brian Garvey has asked, can you talk about the concept of worthy and unworthy victims as it applies to Ukrainians and Yemenis? Has the problem you identified in your book with Edward Herman gotten worse in the last 35 years?
It's amazing. Ed Herman, unfortunately, passed away, but he must be turning over in his grave. I've never seen anything so blatant. I mean, the quote I just gave from Graham Allison, a perfect example. How can we, in our perfection, deal with a monster who invades another country? You probably saw a TV clip of George Bush a couple days ago, who was giving one of these standard denunciations of the demon Putin in Ukraine. And by mistake, he said invasion of Iraq instead of invasion of Ukraine. Quickly corrected himself and laughed. The interesting part was the audience reaction, laughter, and the commentary, laughter. Is it funny? I happened to have an interview in Iraq a couple days afterwards. They didn't think it was funny. It's not funny when we invade, destroy another country, inspire ethnic cleansing, ethnic conflict, which didn't exist, which is tearing the country and the region apart, kill millions of people. It's not a joke. When we do it, it's a joke. It's, I mean, Allison is not the only one. It's standard. A couple of weeks ago, there was a column by Thomas Friedman, big thinker of the New York Times. He said, we're in a new situation. We don't know how to deal with it. We've never dealt with a situation where there's a war criminal on the loose. How can we deal with this? I mean, if you look at commentary in the South, global South, they're just collapsing in ridicule. I can't believe what they're seeing. You've never had a war criminal? I mean, they have a little bit of experience. Their reaction is, we talk constantly about isolating. We have to isolate Russia. You can read in the liberal press, Russia has to be completely isolated. Are we isolating Russia? Or are we isolating ourselves? Take a look at the sanctions map. Europe, the English-speaking countries, maybe Japan tentatively, that's it, not the world. The world's saying, yes, it's deplorable, it's a crime, but what are you upset about? That's what you do to us all the time. We're not going to jump on your bandwagon. In fact, what we're creating is a bipolar world, which will consist of us in Europe, and then there'll be another world based in China. Russia will be part of it, providing it's a declining kleptocracy, but it's an important producer of minerals, probably has the richest supply of minerals in the world. China's perfectly happy to get them on low prices as the market declines. India is just sitting it out. They're not taking sides. Indonesia, the rest of the world, they don't want to be part of this. Yeah, it's deplorable, but you're all a bunch of gangsters. So we're not going to take sides. It's even happening in places like Greece. The closer you get to the third world, the more you get to saying, yeah, it's another crime, just like your crimes. We're not the Harvard version. That's not the world, and the world doesn't accept it.
Thank you. And speaking of China, Ben asked, how might our policy change if the Republicans take over the Congress in November? And how will that affect our current posture towards China, especially now that Russia and China are getting closer?
Well, the Republicans right now means basically Trump pretty much owns the party. They, they worship him. They may hate him, but they have to worship him because he's got a popular base which will kill them unless they worship Trump. Trump is totally a loose cannon. You don't know what he's going to do next. During his term, or he doesn't know either. That's probably what he last saw on Fox News, where they're repeating what he said yesterday. It's during his term in office, he took an extremely harsh line against China. The 2018 the strategic statement written by Yemenis must be the most lunatic statement that has ever appeared in the political record. It called for shifting our focus away from so-called war on terror to fighting, to being prepared to fight simultaneous wars against China and Russia. Simultaneous wars against China and Russia. A war with either China or Russia would destroy the entire world, including us. How can you be talking about being prepared for a war against both China and Russia? Well, I had thought that that was the peak of insanity till the Democrats came in. They upped it. Biden took over the strategic plan and made it worse. You can read the New York Times this morning. There's a report about Secretary of State Blinken and his account of how we have to deter Chinese aggression. Okay? Read the story and see what the examples are of Chinese aggression. Well, they're pouring money into advanced technology, trying to get ahead of us. Plenty of internal repression in China, but that's not aggression. They're they don't abide by what we call the rule-based international order. Those of you who follow international affairs know that there's a very interesting development taking place. There was something called the UN-based system of international order. US doesn't want any of that. UN-based system bans the use of force in international affairs. That's not for us. We want the rule-based international order, where the rules are made in Washington and are implemented in Washington. That's the rule-based international order. Everyone now has to echo that. You want a job in a university in the International Relations Department, you better say this. You want to be a columnist for the New York Times, this is the party line. Rule-based international order where we set the rules. Well, China doesn't obey the rules. There was actually an interesting article by a former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, a pretty distinguished international statesman. This is in Australia. He had an article about the China threat. Australia's very concerned about it. They're right in the jaws of the dragon. So he went through what's the China threat. He went through the various arguments, showed easily that they don't work. He finally concluded that the China threat is that China exists. That's the China threat. They exist and they don't follow orders. Europe follows orders. They're obedient. When the US tears up the Iran agreement, violating Security Council orders, and then imposes harsh sanctions on Iran to punish them for our violation of Security Council orders, Europe doesn't like it. They don't like the sanctions, and they say so, but they obey them. You don't step on the toes of the Godfather. Well, China doesn't act like that. They do what they want. US can't tolerate that, just as the US hasn't been able to tolerate it for Cuba for 60 years. Is Cuba a threat to the United States? Has the most intense sanctions of any country in history. Whole world is opposed to it. UN vote 184-2, US and Israel. Doesn't matter. We impose the harsh sanctions and the world obeys because they're afraid of us with reason. Fortunately, we're an unusually free country. We have access to internal documents beyond any other country that I know. So if you want to become informed, you can. You can read the State Department internal declassified records from the 1960s when the Kennedy mainly, then the Johnson administration were imposing this regime. And they explained it. The reason is Cuba's successful defiance of US policy going back to the 1820s, the Monroe Doctrine, which established our right to dominate the hemisphere. Cuba is defying this, and it's doing it successfully. So therefore, we have to destroy them. You can make up all sorts of stories about human rights violations, whatever you want. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. That's back to worthy and unworthy victims. We strongly support countries with far worse violations without a blink of an eye. But Cuba is a criminal. It's carrying out successful defiance of US policies. Well, China is a much bigger criminal. We can't push them around. And that's frightening. So therefore, the Biden administration has developed a policy that they call encircling China. We have to encircle China with what are called sentinel states. South Korea, Japan, Australia, they have to be heavily armed with weapons aimed at China. The Biden administration has just provided precision weapons, which are more destructive. They have to be backed by a huge fleet of nuclear submarines. One nuclear submarine, one US nuclear submarine can destroy 200 cities anywhere in the world, but they're not destructive enough. They have to be replaced by a new class of more advanced ones surrounding China to protect us from Chinese aggression. Okay? That's what we're witnessing right now. Republicans, probably more extreme, like take Tucker Carlson. He wants to reduce our involvement in Ukraine, sometimes called a dove for that reason, till anybody looks at what he said. We have to reduce it because we don't give a damn about Ukraine. We have to build up our forces for our conflict with China. That's why we have to forget this Ukrainian business. Okay, that's what we're moving into in November. It's very ugly. There's a lot of work to do, but we have to be open about it, understand what's happening. Actually, one thing that's happening right now, very striking, is the meeting that just took place a couple of days ago in Hungary with the most reactionary right-wing extremist forces in Europe. brought together in Hungary the racist, illiberal democracy, which is worshipped by the Republican Party. The big star at the meeting was the Conservative Political Action Committee. It's basically the core of the Republican Party. Donald Trump spoke, praising his friend Viktor Orban, who's demolishing democracy, ending freedom of speech, taking over institutions, destroying the press, extremely racist. That's an alliance that's developing, and it'll be strengthened after November. The United States and the most reactionary forces in Europe, and it extends worldwide. Ukraine, Hungary, has very close relations with Israel. They see themselves as very similar, racist, repressive states, which are condemned by liberal opinion in Europe, a bond between them. Israel itself is now part of a reaction, an alliance of some of the most reactionary states in the world, so-called Abraham Accord, the one triumph of geopolitical triumph of Trump and Kushner. All the deeply reactionary states of the Middle East and North Africa, Israel provides the muscle, linked up closely with India, Modi's establishing a Hindu ethnocracy, bitterly anti-Muslim, violently occupied Kashmir, total severe repression, very natural ally to the United States. So he's very close. That's what's shaping up. It's going to be intensified in November. And the potential is pretty shocking.
Thank you. So before I ask the next question, we are already at 9:03, 6:03, and we planned it for an hour, but I was wondering if you could stay for an extra 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Because we have plenty of questions. Thank you. So another question is, United States was never condemned for the bombing of Yugoslavia, or like we support the and fund Israel invasion of Palestine. So how we can condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
That's what they're asking all over the global South. What they're saying is, what are you complaining about? This is what you do to us all the time. Iraq, Indochina, Panama, anybody you want to attack, you do it. You're never, as I said at the beginning, in what we call civilization, the powerful are immune. Nothing is ever done to them. You can talk about war crimes take a look at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Who do they condemn? Well, African dictators. Westerners? Out of the question. As you probably know, the United States has laws. There's a law passed under the Bush administration, which in Europe is called the Netherlands Invasion Act. It says that if any American is ever brought to The Hague for trial, the executive can use force to rescue him. That's us. You don't fool around with the Godfather. If you want to study international relations, don't look at the academic literature. Look at the literature on the mafia. The world is run very much like the mafia. The Godfather gets his way by force. Others are terrorized into agreeing. Not always. Sometimes they're successful defiance. If you can crush it, crush it. If you can't, encircle it with weapons that can destroy it.
Thank you. Another question we have: United States has been sending billions and billions of dollars in weapons to Ukraine and focusing on the military. But is anyone, Carl Stillwell is asking, is anyone in Washington talking about the existential threat of climate chaos since the war in Ukraine began that people will face?
Not that I can find. Maybe you can. When Biden announced his huge expansion of fossil fuel production, as far as I could see, he was lauded. Wonderful. Now we can race the disaster even faster. And as I said, it's total political theater. Has nothing to do with inflation or gas prices. And there are very feasible actions that could be taken. I'll quote my friend and sometimes co-author Robert Pollin, economist at UMass Amherst, who's done the most extensive and detailed work on very feasible measures to overcome the climate crisis, also engaged in activism. Just has a recent article in which he pointed out that the US government could purchase the entire fossil fuel industry for a cost which is a fraction, small fraction of what the Treasury Department poured out to bail out the financial industry from the costs of the COVID crisis. Nothing out of sight. He didn't bother to point it out, but there's a precedent for this. Well, if the US bought up the fossil fuel companies, could just start following the IPCC recommendations. In fact, orders virtually, start cutting back fossil fuels, move them to renewable energy. To do it right now. There's actually a precedent, an interesting one, which isn't discussed, but you might think about it. In 2009, President Obama essentially nationalized the auto industry. The auto industry was collapsing in the recession. So the government essentially pretty much bought it. Well, that left options. One option was the one that was taken. Let's turn it back to the former owners, maybe different faces, and let them continue to produce what we don't need. More cars, more pollution, more traffic jams. Let them continue to do that. So you want to commute in Boston the way I did for 60 years, sit in a traffic jam for a couple hours. Let them do that, because that's the way you pour money into the hands of the corporate sector. There was another possibility. Turn the auto industries over to the workers and let them produce what we need. Efficient mass transportation. So instead of sitting in a traffic jam for an hour, you can get to work in 10 minutes having a cup of coffee. How about that? Well, that wasn't considered an option, but that's our fault. We didn't create the mass popular movements which could have demanded it. Okay, so therefore we went to the worst option. Well, now we're in a similar situation. The government, with enough popular pressure, the government could do just what Bob Pollin suggested, take over the fossil fuel industry. Very low cost, nothing like what the Treasury pours into the pockets of the financial industry. Then turn it to doing what we need, phasing out fossil fuels, moving to renewable energy. That could save us from disaster. It's not a small, stakes aren't small. Stakes are whether organized human society survives another couple of generations. Can't be higher stakes than that. But it's all sitting right in front of us. With enough organized effort, could be done.
Thank you. So another question, we spoke a little bit about China, and President Biden made a recent commitment to defend Taiwan military. So what are your thoughts on like about US-China relationship and the status of pivot of Asia to Asia?
Since 1979, there has been an agreement between China and the United States over Taiwan. The agreement says, let's keep things quiet and ambiguous. So it's called a one China policy, which formally states that Taiwan is part of China, but there's a tacit agreement that we're not going to do anything about it. That's kept the peace for a long time. Okay. The sensible policies to continue it and to try to move towards reconciliation between China and Taiwan. They also already have strong economic relations. See if you can move it forward. Well, instead, the Biden administration has been making provocative moves, sends high-level officials to China, to Taiwan, which violates the spirit of the agreement. China responds by sending planes, military planes, into Taiwanese airspace. That's the kind of thing that can escalate. You can choose the escalation ladder, or you can choose the path of diplomacy. Those are options. And so sorry, my dog doesn't agree. It's always there. I mean, and the possibilities are very great. Just take a look at history. Take a look at the history of Europe. For centuries, the highest goal of French and Germans was to slaughter each other. Nothing better than that. So every couple of years, you carry out a mass slaughter. Well, what are they doing now? They're peaceful allies in a European Union. A century ago, nobody could have dreamed that there could be a European Union where French and Germans cooperate and trade, commercial, cultural relations, no borders. It was unthinkable, but it's been achieved. Okay, well, other things can be achieved, like Gorbachev's common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok with no military alliances. That can be achieved for everybody's benefit, everybody. Europe would greatly benefit by having an accommodation with Russia. If Russia has to be destroyed, the way Graham Allison tells us from his chair of international relations at Harvard, then of course it's not going to happen. But you don't have to be a Harvard professor. You can also be semi-sane, and you can move towards an accommodation in Europe, Asia, of the kind that Gorbachev proposed and Charles de Gaulle proposed, to the benefit of everyone. That's not impossible.
Sorry for some technical issue. I think one question that which interests a lot of people, and the main question was the war going on right now. What might be a plausible diplomatic solution to end this war? And what is US not doing that it can do to help with ending it?
A possible diplomatic solution has been understood on all sides for years. It would include neutralization of Ukraine. That means Ukraine having a status rather like Austria, or for that matter, like Mexico. Mexico is a perfectly sovereign country, but it can't join a hostile military alliance run by China aimed at the US. Tried to do that, it'd be vaporized. So that's not an option. Well, same could be true of Ukraine. It could be like Austria. Uh, perfect relations with the West, everything, but no hostile military alliance. What then? There's the question of the Donbass region. Well, the proposal that's been on the table for a long time is essentially what's called Minsk II, some degree of autonomy for the Donbass region within a federal Ukraine. That would mean Ukraine would be something like Switzerland or Belgium, which have autonomous regions within the federal structure. There's a question of Crimea. For the moment, it's just not, you can't address it. You can put it off and address it later, but too much is at stake to try to address it now. So let's put it on the back burner, try to end the war. Now, if the United States had been willing to pursue that policy prior to the invasion, might have stopped the invasion. Can't be sure, because if you don't try, you don't know. But it's very likely. Well, it gets harder as the invasion proceeds, but how much is possible, we don't know. There's only one way to find out, to try. You can hear all kind of voices in the United States who are respected for some reason that I don't understand, who tell you it's impossible, let's not try, because Putin's too much of a demon. He's a maniac, a mad dog. So why try? Let's just carry the war on and make things as bad as possible. Well, in my view, such people should be sent to the loony bin, but they're highly regarded and praised. Some of them are even friends of ours, people on the left who say we have to stand up for principle. So while the world goes down in flames, we'll be standing up for principle, feeling very proud. It's not a sensible position. It's how much of this, what should be done, ideally, is there should be an internationally supervised referendum in the Donbass region to just see what the people want. I mean, there's Russia-oriented population, Ukraine-oriented population. Let's see what they want and follow that. In principle, the same could be done in Crimea, although everyone is pretty much in agreement that the vote would be for movement towards Russia. But let's carry it out. Internationally supervised referendum. These are all feasible things. They can't be done unless there is, first of all, unless first the US stops undermining the possibility. That's the first step. Let's stop undermining it in the manner that I've described. Then move to the next step. See if you can facilitate it. All the international settlements that take place, they're almost anything that works at all is with some kind of international supervision. Very little happens on its own unless the great powers at least support it, accept it, maybe help advance it. So first step is stop undermining it, so maybe it can proceed. Then, if possible, try to facilitate it. The decision will be in the hands of the people on the ground. Ukrainians will make the decision about what they want to do, but we can extend the range of options so that one of them is moving towards a political settlement. If they don't want it, their choice. They do want it, good, you know.
So one of also most recent news that we learn about is Finland and Sweden submitting their applications for the NATO. how can uh, those two countries affect the war, and how will the joining to NATO, this expansion will affect the events that are happening?
That's quite interesting. About a week or two ago, I had a long interview with a foreign policy group in Sweden. We talked about this, and in my preliminary remarks, I pointed out something curious that I asked them to explain to me. In Sweden, same in Finland, the intellectual elites, the policy class, are consumed with two ideas. One idea is gloating over the fact that Russia has demonstrated that its military is a paper tiger, can't even conquer cities 30 kilometers from its border that are defended by a mostly citizens militia. Total paper tiger, can't do a thing. They're all very happy and excited about that. That's one idea. The other idea is that we have to cower in terror before this paper tiger, because even though it's never given any hint of wanting to do so, it's planning to conquer us. Well, there's a word for that. George Orwell had a word. It was called doublethink. It's the capacity to have two contradictory ideas in mind and believe both of them. Orwell thought it was a feature of hyper-totalitarian societies. It was wrong. It's a feature of liberal, democratic, free societies. Two ideas in mind, totally contradictory, have to pursue both of them. So what's actually going in mind? Well, it's not very obscure. Sweden and Finland have quite powerful military systems. They're already partially integrated into NATO, not formally, but carry out joint exercises, sell arms, and so on. For the Saab munitions corporation in Sweden, be terrific to have an open door to NATO, no more barriers. Same with Finland. Actually, Finland has the largest reserves of any European country. Is there a security problem? It's laughable. First of all, Russia's never even made a hint of any concern, any idea of this, and it'd be crazy. I mean, they can't do anything a couple miles from their border. These are powerful states. You take a look at Europe, current, which is consumed by the same two ideas. So they have to build up their military force, like Germany. Germany has to build up its military force till it'll be the most powerful military force in Europe. In fact, current projections in a couple of years, German military will be more powerful than Russia. Does that awaken some memories? Well, it does for me. I'm sure it does for Russians. Germany alone is going to be a more powerful military force than Russia. Well, I don't have to go any further. The idea that there's some security issue doesn't rise to the level of comical. There are issues. It's very helpful to the right wing in Finland and Sweden to move towards NATO membership internally. They can crush social democratic initiatives because we have to arm to the teeth to defend ourselves against the paper tiger. We're not unfamiliar with that. Well, all of those things matter, but not security. In fact, this is kind of a long story, but if you're really serious and you try to look at when states consider security, almost never. Maybe security of the business sector or the political elite, but not security of the population. That's almost never a concern in state policy. That's very easy to demonstrate. They don't teach it in international relations courses, but you can figure it out yourself. That's quite easy to show. There's some startling examples when you look at it seriously.
So I think we have one last question, time for a question. So Russia has become one of the most sanctioned country in the world since it invaded Ukraine on February 24th. Those sanctions were primarily imposed in order to target the government and the inner circle of Putin. However, unfortunately, it is the ordinary Russian citizens who were impacted the most by these massive sanctions. Do you agree that this was the right way to respond to the invasion? And if not, what should have the US and Europe done in response to this outrageous war?
First of all, we should remember where we are. We're in the United States, the leading warrior state. When questions come up, they are restricted to what are the forceful measures that we can take? What are the proper modes of violence, the proper modes of harming others? Is that the only question? How about asking, what measures can we take to alleviate the problem? What measures can we take to reduce the destruction? What measures can we take to keep people from being killed, to keep for the consequences to follow? That question just doesn't arise in the United States. We're a state that's dedicated to force and pressure, not to diplomacy, not to negotiations. It's reflexive. What I quoted from the Australian International Affairs Journal is quite accurate. So the first question we ask is, what forceful measures can we take? Should be the second question. First question should be, what can we do to alleviate the problem? But we can't ask that. So let's go to the second question. What kind of sanctions should be used? And first of all, there's a record of sanctions, long record, teaches us a lot. Sanctions typically harm the population, don't bother the elite at all, even strengthen them, because the population has to cower under their umbrella to survive. It's been true just about every case. And I think it's true in this case. Putin and all of his super rich friends, including himself, they're not harmed by the sanctions. The sanctions go after the Russian population. It was the same with the sanctions against Saddam Hussein, virtually all of them. So if you could do, and notice there's something else about sanctions. Which country in the world can impose sanctions? One, the United States. Nobody else imposes sanctions. When they do, it's subordinate to the United States. If the US sanctioning somebody, somebody else can join in. That should tell us something. Is the US the only country that never does anything wrong? Well, it tells you something about what sanctions are. So I think it makes sense as a secondary phenomenon after you're pursuing peaceful measures to impose some kind of sanctions on the leadership of those who have committed crimes. That should be international, should be through the United Nations. United Nations might agree to impose sanctions on the leadership, not the United States, not Russia, not any other state. Same with weapons. Makes good sense to provide weapons to people under attack so that they can defend themselves as secondary to trying to end the war. That comes first, okay? As secondary, yes, people should be able to defend themselves. But then the kinds of weapons that should be sent should be carefully calibrated. Are they helping the victims or are they harming the victims? For example, if you send offensive weapons, they're going to harm the victims because that's just going to call up a bigger response by a much more powerful state that has no limits to its capacity to devastate. So you have to think about the kinds of weapons you want to send. But all of this is secondary to what we never do. Try to seek peace, try to prevent the crimes, and try to end them if they're taking place. We barely ever talk about that, which is a statement attributed to Winston Churchill. Nobody knows if he actually said it, but the statement is that what he said is, jaw is better than war. It's better to talk than to kill. Okay, it's a good point.
And on that note, I want to thank you for taking your time and being here with us tonight and sharing all this very insightful and amazing information. So yeah, thank you for taking your time and being here.
Thank you. Very good to be with you. Glad to be home again, sort of.